Good to be back in Ann Ridge. Good to be back at, the name keeps changing, so I'm not quite sure what to call it. Trinity Anglican School. It's great to be with you. It was a short, almost 40 years ago, that I would be sitting over about right in here. I would be soaking wet because I rode my motorcycle in from Glen Willard on the other side of the river, and I would be sopping on the pew, getting ready to learn and to be blessed. So fortunate, the professors I had, as you see sitting here among them, and just what a wonderful time it was. It was great, and it is good to be back. I must say, having lived in the Southwest now for a long time, I am not used to gray skies. I am used to sunshine and blue skies and this kind of rainy, dreary gray that doesn't go away until May. I'm not used to that. But it is truly wonderful to be here. I've been really loving working my way in year B, working my way through Mark. Mark does a remarkable job. I really do love John's gospel, but Mark is something, it moves so fast through Mark. And the thing that's caught me this year is something that like I said, it was 40 years ago I was learning homiletics and hermeneutics and how to put a sermon together and how to evaluate a passage, how to preach on a passage. And I fell into a trap for much of that 40 years, and it's different this year, and I'll just explain that very briefly, and that is, you tend to get a pericope, you tend to get a lesson, and you look at them, you compare them, perhaps the collect is the key that unlocks everything that puts them all together. I've been blessed by that for years, seeing how the collect influences the lessons that they chose. But this year, the thing that has gotten me in Mark is to not just look at a lesson, a pericope in isolation, but to put it in the setting that Mark put it in. And that's opened up whole new worlds to me to compare what came before, what came 2 or 3 stories before, what's coming 2 or 3 stories afterward, and to not look at it in isolation, but to see the bigger picture. And I encourage you also to do that. Especially I love, it's always a challenge of mine to look when they set up the lectionary, if there's commas, meaning there's verses they left out. Those are sometimes the juicy bits. And it's really good to go back and pick up your word and open it up and fill in the commas, and then also go before to chapter 2, go after chapter 2. So, right now I'm serving as the chaplain in a nursing home, and we came to this lesson, and we used it this last Sunday, and the nursing home people are really pretty amazing. In some ways, they're like little children because they look at things simply and they cut to the chase very quickly. And they hear this lesson and about plucking your eye out and cutting your hand off and cutting your foot off, and they're like, whoa, that's really bad. And then the inevitable question, did Jesus really mean we should be cutting our legs off? And I go back to when I studied with Dallas Willard, and Dallas Willard said, no, that's not really what Jesus is trying to get at. If we follow that literally, there's going to be a lot of one-legged blind people running around in hell. And the point wasn't, your feet or your hands. The point was your heart. And so we come to this lesson today, and it's wonderful to also compare a bit to, I like the phrase that we got in the song, Lord, help me to resist presumptuous sins. Let's think. Take hold of me and gain control of it. Presumptuous sins. And that's really at the heart of all the lessons that we have today, is the sin of presumptuousness, saying that we are crucial to the spreading of the kingdom. Me, my camp, my understanding. And Jesus just challenges that. So to put Mark in its setting, it's really fun to understand. The poor disciples just don't get it when he feeds the multitudes twice up to this point in time. Of course, he's enacting that which was a sign to the Jews that the prophet like Moses, who would deliver bread in the wilderness, was among them. And if that wasn't enough, then after he delivers bread in the wilderness, and then the other sign of Moses, of course, is as they come to the Red Sea, Moses parts the waters. He has control over nature, and they get to go on a journey toward the Promised Land. And so Jesus gives them bread in the wilderness, like Moses, not once, twice. But then the one time he gets the disciples set out in a boat, storm comes up, and Jesus comes to them walking on the water. So Moses parts the water, but Jesus does one better and walks on it. And even seeing that, they still are like, I wonder what's going on. The real irony is that the other time they get in a boat, finally they're hungry. And they say, Jesus, we're really hungry. You got to do something. And he's like, oh. After he's fed multitudes, they still think they're going to starve to death in a boat on the Sea of Galilee when Jesus is with them. So the poor disciples are struggling. They're struggling. Then we kind of come to what's happening today, where you have this scene. It's kind of laid out, and I love to fill it in a little bit like The Chosen kind of fills in things. And so I see Jesus sitting perhaps around a campfire. The disciples are gathered with him. They're having a little bit of a talk, but there's also not just the disciples. There is kids running around. And the kids come in twice in the lesson that we have today. So the kids, I think, are important. If Mark's going to mention the kids twice, pay attention to them. They have something to do with what's going on. And so they're sitting there, the kids are kind of playing, and the one disciple turns to Jesus and he says, hey, you know, I'm really bothered by this. We saw some people and they were casting out demons in your name. We should have stopped them, right? I mean, because, and here's the key, it says, because they weren't following us. It wasn't they weren't following you. It was they weren't following us. And I think that's really the key to unlock what's going on with all this discussion. They weren't following us. The disciples, you see, were caught in a trap that was called presumptuous sin trap. That everything needs to flow through them. They are the special agents. They are the ministers who are doing all this stuff. Now, Jesus did call them together, set them out, and they did cast out demons, and they succeeded. But the other thing that's really interesting in Mark, as he's setting this up, you have a story just previously, in which, once again, Jesus is coming down off of the Mount of Transfiguration. He's just revealed to Peter, James, and John who he is. And as he's coming down, he comes across the rest of the disciples, and they're arguing. They're arguing because there was a man there who brings his son to meet the disciples. And saying, my son has been possessed by demons since his youth, and this demon casts him into fires and drowns him. Please help, help. And the disciples do everything they can in their own strength to get this demon out of this boy, but they fail. Well, there's some scribes and Pharisees watching all this. And when they see the disciples fail, naturally they come up and say, oh. They're always looking for an excuse to get on Jesus or his disciples. Oh, guys, are you having a bad day? What's the matter? Why can't you help this boy? You guys are losers. Bunch of losers. Look at you. Jesus comes up on the scene. And by this time, too, the demon has been listening to this boy, listening to the failure of the disciples, and they figured the rabbi of these guys, he must be a loser too. And right there in front of Jesus, throws the boy down on the ground. As if he's to say, nah. I'll show you. And Jesus casts the demon out. And the boy looks like he's dead. And Jesus raises him up. Beautiful resurrection imagery. Raises him up. And the boy is restored, fine. And the disciples are just, when they finally sit down, why couldn't we do that? And Jesus' response is, well, some can only be driven out by prayer. And you look at it and you say, prayer, okay. But what's the key to prayer that the disciples were missing? And it comes back to the presumptuous sin. I believe that the disciples believed they could do things in their own power, their own way, their own strength. And that's why they failed. And Jesus says only through prayer, but the secret of prayer, you see, is to say, and this is the Son of Man saying you need to do it through prayer. And you think of everything Jesus does, that he prays before he does it. This is the Son of God, who created everything that is or was or ever will be. And he prays before he does what he does. And the disciples missed that little clue, thinking, well, you just go ahead and do it. We've done it in the past, we can do it again. Presumptuous sin. And so, through prayer, you have to rely on the Father. The strength of the Father, the power of the Holy Spirit. Even the Son of God does so, showing the disciples the way. But they just don't get it. And here, to tweak it all, they're gathered around the fire. Kids running around playing. And they come and they say, hey, these guys down the street, strangers, they are casting out demons in your name. We should stop them! Do you see the irony? The guys from the coffee store down the street are doing what the disciples could not do. And rather than look at themselves and say, what are we missing? Jesus, what are we missing? They say, let's stop those guys. Stop them. So Jesus grabs one of the kids, and here's where the kids come in, sits him on his knee. And he begins to explain, too, about anyone who would harm one of these little ones is better to tie a millstone around his neck. Then he says, and anyone who would give even one of these little ones a cup of water in my name, just as the guys from the coffee shop were casting out demons in his name, in my name, according to my will, according to my purposes. Anyone who does that should surely not lose his reward. So Jesus is showing them with the kids, who, as you know, in that culture, had basically they were worthless. They were considered nothing. They had no power. They had no status. They had nothing. And so the mere fact that they're playing around Jesus, and Jesus, typically like Jesus, likes having kids around instead of saying, get those dirty little kids away from me. Let the children come to me, Jesus says. And now he's saying, even if you serve somebody who everybody else thinks is worthless, even the simple act like giving them a cup of water, this is the right attitude. Why? Because it's not presumptuous. It's the right attitude. And then I'll just wrap it up because we get to it here. At the end of this passage, there's a really difficult statement. It's really hard to understand. And once again, looking at Mark and looking at everything and the setting that Mark is setting everything in, I really missed it most of my life. And I wonder if you guys had ever picked it up. But it says, after he does the pluck your eye out, cut your leg off, and your hand off, he goes, for everyone will be salted with fire. That verse just jumped out. What the heck is that? And then he goes on and he fills it in a little bit. Salt is good. But if salt has lost its saltiness, how will you make it salty again? Have salt in yourselves. And then he finally wraps it up with, and be at peace with one another. So Jesus, the other pieces of Mark that we fill in here is, Jesus, even though he's shined radiantly in all his glory upon the Mount of Transfiguration, He's made two announcements up to this point in time, and the two announcements are basically this. I'm going to Jerusalem, and they're going to hand me over, and they're going to beat me, and they're going to crucify me. But on the third day I'll rise again. And the disciples just spoke. So on a simple level, definition of disciple from Dallas Willard. Somebody who spends so much time with a rabbi that they become like them so they can do the things they do. What are the disciples doing? Spending time with Jesus for 3 years. A 3-year camping trip, spending time with Jesus so they can even become like him and do the things he does. Well, they just failed with the casting out demon thing. Failed miserably. But at the heart of it, Jesus is saying, my whole mission is to go to Jerusalem where I will be handed over. In essence, he's saying, I will give up my life in Jerusalem. That's the whole heart of what's going on with me. And if the disciples are hearing this thinking, well, we spend time with him so that we can become like him and do the things he does, that means a disciple of Jesus must be one who's willing to lay down his life for others, out of love for others. Pretty clear message of the gospel. And the disciples can't wait to get to Jerusalem. And that's why they're having fights around the fireside. Which one of us is the greatest? I get to sit on the right hand. I get to sit on the left. Think of the money and the power and the status. It's the exact opposite of what Jesus is trying to model to them, which is, this is not about what you get, it's about what you give up. And what you give up is not just your foot, or your eye, or your hand, it's your whole life. And it may be giving it up even for one that nobody else cares about. A Samaritan woman at the well, a little kid, a leper. The last, the least, and the lost, laying down your life for them. That's the whole thing. And we get finally to the end of it, and it's salt. Having salt. And I think what salt is, I think when you look at it in the Gospels, it's the ability to not have, it's the opposite of presumptuous sins. It's not what I get, or who I get to serve me. He who would be first in the kingdom must be last, and the servant of all. There's the salt. And the disciples, at this point in time, Jesus, how long do I have to put up with you guys? He says to them. Because he's looking at these guys that are going to be the future of building the kingdom of God. And they're losing their saltiness. And he cries out to them, don't. Come back. Learn that he who will be greatest must be the servant of all. It's a message we need to learn. In ministry, I think especially. That's why I think my favorite service in all of the liturgical year is Monday, Thursday, when we wash the feet of those that we serve. And the introduction says, and none need reminded more than God's ministers and his clergy that he who would be great must be the servant of all.